I made years of mistakes when I first owned an airplane because I operated airplanes the same way I had while in flight school. And unfortunately, there are some very bad habits that you do develop in flight schools that can be really detrimental once you actually own the airplane. Now, some of these I've learned the hard way, and then others were more apparent to me once I read all 500 pages of this book, Mike Bush on Engines. And it is fantastic. I wish that I wouldn't have put off reading it for so long because it's kind of daunting because it's literally 500 pages deep dive about engines. But to someone that learned in flight schools and then owned an airplane, like some of these things, I just really wish someone would have taught this to me earlier. And so I will bet that your flight school did not or is not teaching you the things that I'm about to talk about in this video. And once you own an airplane, these things are so important, and I've really learned it the hard way. First, you should definitely consider getting a digital engine monitor of some kind that allows you to monitor the temperatures of individual cylinders. The analog gauge in most of your airplanes isn't very helpful because it's vague, and furthermore, it's actually only pulling data from one of the cylinders. But a digital engine monitor will help in so many ways, especially with managing those temperatures, because running the cylinders too hot is a really easy way to limit their useful life and cause expensive repairs. Now, if you're like me, you probably didn't train in an airplane that was equipped with one of these gauges, and so obviously you didn't know how to use it, but then secondly, you also didn't know the importance of it. And one important part of the flight that you can accidentally really hurt your engine is during climb. You can overheat your engine really easily as you're climbing out because the engine doesn't have very much aerodynamic cooling. There's not a lot of air coming through it, and the air is warm because you're still low, and you're running the engine as hard as it will go. And then to make matters worse, if you're anywhere like me in Texas and you're flying in the middle of summer, you're probably just baking on the ramp as you're number 9 for takeoff at Addison and doing your run up and stuff. The engine got pretty hot. And so if you're not careful, like a couple minutes after takeoff, you can get really hot cylinder head temperatures, but you wouldn't really know that unless you're equipped with one of these digital gauges. And depending on who you ask, you really don't want to run Continental cylinders hotter than about 400 degrees and Lycoming engines hotter than like 420 degrees. So the great thing about these digital monitors is that you can set off an alarm well before you ever get to that threshold. That way you can start intervening and avoid running them too hot. The second bad habit I formed in flight schools was not leaning the mixture on the ground during taxi. Really, we would just lean it during cruise and that was about it. But unless you want fouled spark plugs, you really want to be leaning aggressively even on the ground, especially if you're at sea level. Now that was never taught to me until my mechanic actually told me my spark plugs were fouled and asked me if I was leaning on the ground. And that's the first time I'd ever even heard of that. One of the common themes here is that you can develop these bad habits in training and literally never pay the price for it until you actually own the airplane and you own it long enough to realize, oh, every time I'm not leaning on the ground, it's creating fouled spark plugs because you're actually the one paying for the maintenance bill. And that's not necessarily the flight school's fault or problem because they're not necessarily there to teach you about airplane ownership. They're there to help you get your license. But I do think some more stress and emphasis could be placed on, hey, we know we're teaching you the legality here of being a pilot, but if you're ever an airplane owner, here's some other things like the practical implications of what's happening. Like you might be training here in Dallas where it's all like sea level and it's all hot, but what happens when you go to another state or you want to fly in the winter? These are things you need to be thinking about. And I feel like I was a little undertrained and underprepared when it came to that, and I've learned a lot of lessons once I actually own the airplane. A good example of this is when it comes to oil changes. Now the flight school is doing all their own maintenance, and so oil changes and stuff really never come up during training. But once you own the airplane, there are a few key components of oil changes that were not apparent to me right away. First is that it's not just a time to change the oil and keep it clean. I mean, it's definitely for that, but even more importantly, this is also a really good time to take a snapshot of the health of the engine without really having to take anything apart. This happens through inspecting the oil screen and the filter to visibly check for metals to see if the engine is making metal, so to speak, but then also sending off a sample of that oil to the lab to get analyzed for metal particles that are microscopic, they're too small to see. And at first, I never got an oil analysis. Mechanic would say, hey, do you want an oil analysis? I say, no, don't really understand that. But then I realized how important they are. Like you'll get data back on how much various metals are present in your oil in parts per million. I mean, these are microscopic traces of metal, but they can be early warning signs of trends in your engines. Now, all engines make a little metal while they run, it's just part of it, but analyzing this for trends will help you know what to start monitoring or inspecting before it becomes a bigger issue based on what kind of metal is starting to increase. Now, you'll also want to monitor oil consumption at each oil change. Basically, big changes in oil consumption rates can be a warning sign for cylinder wear and for other things. And because I hadn't really noticed a change in oil consumption, for the last several years of owning an airplane, hadn't really thought of that. But going forward, because of this book, I'm going to keep a log to monitor how much oil the airplane is using between oil changes. So basically, when I first owned the airplane, I really thought that oil changes were not too far off from doing it in your car. Like, hey, just get it changed every X miles and move on with your life. But actually, it's a really, really important inspection point if you'll treat it as such. And speaking of inspection, if you're using one of those digital engine monitors, you should be able to have a download feature where you can actually extract all of the data that that monitor is collecting. It's not just showing you in real time in the cockpit, it's also storing all of that data that you can later analyze. And transparently, I've never done this because I didn't really know how to analyze it. But after reading this book, I realized different ways that you could analyze it. But furthermore, SavvyAviation.com, which is I'm looking at the book over here, Mike Bush's company, they offer a really, really unique service that I'm going to try out and I'm going to report back on this, where basically you can upload all of your data from dozens of flights and they will analyze all of the different, metrics that this is gathering about your engine, all the temperatures, fuel flow, you name it. If it gathers it, they're analyzing it versus all of the other similar airplanes in your cohort. And then they basically will just send you a report saying, hey, here's where you are versus the entire cohort in terms of fuel consumption, in terms of engine temperatures, in terms of all of those things. And they give you actionable insights as to how you are actually operating the airplane and maybe where you're out of line with everybody else. And you can basically get coached on how to manage your engine, because that is a huge hole that I've noticed in training. I mean, you're really just trying to learn the regulations and how to talk on the radio and how to fly the airplane in the first place. But once you actually own the airplane, there's so much more in terms of managing and monitoring the engine that I totally just did not appreciate until I actually got into ownership. And so a tool like this from SavvyAviation.com can really just help give you a second set of eyes on this. So all of that data can be analyzed, and it probably should be analyzed. The other thing they can do with it is they can spot it for trends to see if you have any signs of maybe exhaust valve failure or impending failure and things. And they will send you notifications after analyzing some of your flights if they're spotted anything that's going awry. So I can't wait to try this out. I'm absolutely going to. Another big thing you can miss while training at a flight school is the danger of cold starts. Now in Texas, it doesn't freeze that much, and even when it does, the airplanes that I was training in slept in hangars. So even on cold mornings, the airplanes weren't that cold, and so true cold starts were not really an issue other than just priming the engine a little bit more than normal. But if you start your engine and the internal temperature is below freezing, you can do some serious damage to your engine really quickly. And that's because the metals inside the engine, notably the pistons and the cylinders, are made of different kinds of metals that expand at different rates. And so when you start the engine and it's below freezing, you can really easily create metal-to-metal contact that the oil is not helping you with, regardless of the oil temperature, and that can cause damage very, very quickly. Now, in Texas, that just wasn't really stressed to me because the reasons I just mentioned. But then what happens when you own the airplane, you get adventurous and you say, hey, let's go to Idaho. And even in the summer in Idaho, I have a picture of it here, we built a snowman in June in Idaho because a cold front came in. And so what happens when you left your airplane on the ramp and you didn't think anything of it, and all of a sudden, hey, it's 30 degrees, 25 degrees, whatever, the airplane will probably start, and you do start it. You can cause a lot of damage very quickly. And so you really want to avoid cold starts. Either try to get it in a hangar or definitely preheat. It's not just about preheating the oil, it's about preheating the entire engine to really try to have a uniform temperature. That danger was definitely under stress to me, but when you're the one paying the bill, the maintenance bill, this stuff gets your attention pretty quickly. So that's a 500-page book in a few minutes. And if you want my 5 years of airplane ownership experience in 5 minutes, it's on the screen now. So I'll see you there.